I'd like to welcome Shantanu Bhattacharya on our series of podcasts for Purple Quarter. Welcome, Shantanu.
Hi, thank you so much, Rupa. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
So, just a little bit of introduction about Shantanu. I've known him for about 3 years now. It's been interesting times whenever we've met. Shantanu's moved from analytics into data. He's been a founder himself and then moved into data and right now manages the entire data sciences function for Airtel X Labs. So, Shantanu, quite a bit of a journey, right? Analytics, then a founder, then you moved on to doing your own research papers. You did everything: technology, product, data sciences, data sciences. So, what is your thing? What is the flavor that we can actually derive from Shantanu?
Perfect. So the flavor has always been data, right? So I did my PhD in astrophysics. I worked for NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center on the Cassini program. Cassini is the spacecraft that orbited around Saturn and was first spacecraft that was intentionally sort of destroyed so that it did not, in 1 in 10,000 years, accidentally land on one of Saturn's moon, which scientists think that there are potential for life there. Um, so I worked there. Part of the PhD was data analysis. Came out of that, did a data startup. So it's been the common thread has been data. I mean, I did. Interestingly enough, someone mentioned to me that I was the only person they knew who had done 4 things for 4 years or plus their lives. Right? I have been in academics. I have been a startup person. I have been in large companies, and I was in management consulting. And the same question is, what's the common thread? The common thread also has always been data. You look at the data, you try to figure out what problems you can solve with that, either scientific or business, and then you sort of take it from there and do that, right? And the part that sort of kept me going is I immensely enjoy what I do.
Mm-hmm.
I come to work every day, 7 days a week. That's been a matter of habit for 20, 25 years now. And I immensely enjoy what I do.
Great, great. So if I do recall the time that we met, Shantanu, it was interesting times because India was moving towards improvising technology with respect to supply chain. And I think there are, even now, if I can put it that way, supply chain still seems like a broken segment, right? People are using unstructured data still to look at how do they fix this problem. Do you see anything, if anything's moved from the time that you came here, you started looking at this segment? Has anything changed? And if it has, what is it that you think has changed brilliantly well?
Okay, interesting. So I actually, my last job before moving to India was Facebook, running emerging market programs. So emerging market programs or EMP products. Emerging EMP is defined as 350 million plus users of Facebook back in 2014 in 79 countries between Brazil and Papua New Guinea. So it was defined by 3 things, right? One was low-end phones, and low-end Android phone back in those days, Nokia, Asha 210 and 510 were the edge, which is feature phones. Second thing was poor network, and third thing was people's inabilities to spend on data. Data was very expensive back then. So when I was trying to solve that problem, what I came across was something called what I have fondly so since then defined as India class problems. So in data, the India class problems are very distinct than what I call the Western class problems. So for example, in the West, most things about people are available in a structured format. Take an example. My former house in Fremont, California. The only way you can reach 78749, Canyon Heights Drive, Fremont, California, etc. Right? The only thing that you can put between Fremont and CA, California, whether you put a comma or not. There's no other option. My house in Bangalore has 6 government documents in 6 different ways, right? It's either Villa 146, or it's Townhouse TH 146, or it's TH-A 146. Purva Parkridge is spelled in different ways. Sometimes the Parkridge is 1, Purva is P-O-O-R-V-A or P-U-R-V-A. The locality is either Garuda Chapalia or Mahadevpura. Or in some cases, they just call it Garuda Chapalia Mahadevpura, which doesn't exist in documents. Goshala Road is spelled in multiple ways, right? And that's just in a locality that's highly structured. This is infrastructure. Think of the other extreme, right? In small towns, right? A typical address would be uh, east of the clock tower, fourth gully, make a right near Mahadev's medical store, go and ask where Raju's house is, right? That's a typical address in a tier 2, tier 3 town. I come from a tier 2, tier 3 town, and that's the standard of the data. Now, trying to figure that out and sort of decompose it into something that will get you a location has been a challenging problem. And when I was at Delhi, the first company, fortunately, so I came back here and was looking for a company where I would be able to work on, as I call it, the highly complex media class problems. Fortunately, what happened then at Delivery, it was Delivery was a small company, smaller company than it is today. Today it's an unicorn. It was much smaller back then. I was able to convince the leadership that this is a problem worth working on. They were already working on it, but it took off in a big way. So just take that as an example. Uh, Back in those days, we only used, if you went to Google in 2014, 2015, and tried to disambiguate the addresses as written in the format, you could only get about 30% of the houses nationwide, the latitude and longitude. They could resolve it down to some latitude, longitude. Whether that latitude, longitude was correct or not, that's a different question. In 5 years since then, what I know of the latest, I have left them, but what I know of them is that about 90+%, perhaps even 95% of the addresses nationwide now can be resolved up to 160 meter, which means 80 meter on this side or 80 meter on that side, which is a dramatic improvement. The improvements are in the order of your efficiency have gone up 40–50% as a result of that, right? So that's one small example. Actually, it's not a small one, big example of how supply chain has improved dramatically. The second bucket where it's improved is a lot of automation, right? So for example, a lot of the supply chain has now have used IoTs and other devices, right? To sort of track it in real time as you do it. But that's just the example that I gave you as just the last mile, right? But even on what I call is the middle mile, right? The city to city. The supply chains have gotten better because of the use, the trucks are getting equipped with IoT, you are starting to get real-time data. The e-toll facilities that of the national highways have cut down the time to cross the tolls significantly and so on. So a lot of it is a combination of automation. That automation itself is generating tons of data, and your ability to process that data, capture the data, process the data, and making intelligence out of it has actually made the supply chain far, far better than it had been, say, even in 5 years.
That's brilliant. So this, if I were to actually look at it, this is from the point of pickup to when it comes to me. So if Shantanu, if we go a little more backward from in terms of the warehouse and how things get put into a box. I've read a lot of articles that you've written, to be honest with you. So I just wanted to check in terms of, do you think that the robotics and these things would come back into in when you look at what's happening around us? Do you think that's a possibility?
It's interesting you mentioned that. What I think is not necessarily only robotics. Yes, robotics will start playing a role in that, because at some point in time, the volume that's, the volume big e-commerce is growing, right? I saw a prediction saying that by 21–22, which is the next financial year, 11% of retail will go to e-commerce, which just when I had entered delivery, it was less than 3%. So it's 4x as a percentage of the total retail, and the retail itself is growing at certain percentage, right? So it's a massive growth, right? At some point in time, you will not be able to optimize further, but just having more and more people, right? There's only so many people you can hire, and there's so many people you can accommodate in your warehouse, right? So the robotics will take place. Robotics will take place to sort of enabling more automation. So for example, just picking up from a shelf and getting an item to a pack area. So the pick and pack process, the pick process can be robotized, right? You can have actually, in fact, experiments are already going on to see how the pick process can be robotized. It goes to a shelf. There have been 3-dimensional warehouses that people are already experimenting with abroad, and those things will come, right? Which means a robot walks in and then goes in 3-dimension, right? It sort of goes up, picks a box, comes down and gives it to the pack area, right? So those things are improving, right? But one of the things that sort of is interesting that I think will we haven't seen at all in India and will start picking up in a big way is the use of video analytics, right?
Mm.
Which is as you start, and this is where we just saw an inflection point that most people are not realizing. The inflection point is the COVID. It's the one in 100-year event.
Right.
And when an event like this happens, what happens? People's habits change. You and I were not used to wearing masks. And nowadays, you sort of, if you step out of your house, today I stepped out of my house and then realized I hadn't picked up the mask and I went back to the house, right? People are maintaining social distance, or at least trying to maintain, some people are. So as these new norms sort of get embedded, and this is not going to go away anytime soon, although you may think a lot of it will be enabled by CCTV cameras and videos, right? In fact, there are a couple of companies that I'm looking at, startups. They are starting to figure out how to use those image in terms of automatically enforcing a bunch of stuff, right? So today they're starting with automatically enforcing mask wearing and social distancing, as simple as that, or cleaning SOPs. Tomorrow they can start looking at still, how people work, right? There used to be a study back in when I was a management consultant. It used to be called time and motion study, which is people would sit down and watch factory workers to see how much time they're spending in different activities and try to optimize it. So one of the famous examples, and I had worked with the automaker, it looked like a parts that was getting over at a station. The distance from the warehouse or the local supply area to that warehouse, to that stand, people would have to walk and spend 10 minutes trying to get the next setup. So people actually moved along the location of where the parts are kept. Right? The time and motion studies are very useful in getting productivity up. The challenge with time and motion studies is they're very expensive because people are doing that. Right? You needed people who are less than 5 years is my guarantee. When video analytics will start looking at all the movements within a warehouse, within a factory, and essentially start figuring out what makes people more efficient, right? It may be the way people are packing boxes. It may be the way people are moving between different areas of the factory. It may be as simple as the location of the cafeteria versus how they come back, right? So I'll give you an example. Today, I was talking to a factory in Chennai area, right? And a lot of people reach out to me. 6,000 employees, 6,000 people in a shift. Let's call it a auto component maker, right? So today, what is the new SOP? The new SOP is that refrigerant temperature needs to be checked before you let them in. So imagine if you are checking 6,000 people's temperature, how long would it take? Make a guess.
About an hour, hour and a half.
2 hours. So in an 8-hour shift, if you take 2 hours to let people in, your productivity drops 25%. So what do you do?
Automate it? I mean, computer vision?
So what they're saying is that we have cameras. People are wearing masks, no? People are also wearing a hat. So now only this much of the faces is good. So they're asking me, can you talk to people or can you introduce us to companies which can just look at this and say, hey, this is an employee. They have the thermal images, the IR cameras, infrared cameras that can automatically take temperature and sort of let people in. It can do two things. The thermal images today are used only for sort of making sure you see them at the airport, right? They make sure that you don't have temperature, right? But now if you can take the same image and it also says Rupa and Shantanu and they're legitimate factory workers and check you in, then the whole thing you are estimating, you are sitting down, you're just doing a sort of a, literally a brain function type of work, writing down. It looked like the 2-hour check-in process can actually be done as little as between 20 minutes to half an hour. Not a massive improvement, but it's still 20 to 30 minutes, but that's a massive improvement over 2 hours, right? And now by figuring out how many stations you can open in parallel, how many cameras you can buy, you can actually do it in 5 to 10 minutes eventually, right? So that's where, because we are at an inflection point, a lot of the habits will change, and when habits change, two things happen. Smart businesses start, and they try to figure out how to sort of take advantage of that. They call it pandemic, call it disruption, and sort of build a new world order or a new way of working. Right? I think that's what we sort of, none of us are sort of spending, a lot of us are not spending a time saying that, look, if the pandemic is not a disruption, it's a massive opportunity to sort of unlock down, I'm calling the word unlock down, unlocking down the economy. And as you unlock down, figure out how to make it more efficient.
Right, right. No, these are going to be interesting times, like you rightly said. I think this is when an important point for people to actually figure out what can be done during this time and age, right? Even if I think there are two sets of audience. One is saying that hey, it's survival of the fittest. Second is looking at if this is going to be the new world, how do we adapt? And I think both survival and how to adapt is going to be the flavor. That's how I'm looking at it as well.
And the enabler is going to be the technology, right? Some of it is going to be process, obviously, but new technology, as I said, my big bet is that video analytics and vision science is going to take off like crazy, because a lot of the things that we do for sort of keeping an eye on people and trying to, instill the new order, the new SOPs and new working, you cannot have, for example, as many people monitoring. So think of it this way: if a supervisor has to enforce in a 6,000 people factory that everyone's wearing the mask, right, wearing the eye shield, which is required to work in a component factory, and a hat. So guess what happens? So we figured out. I'll just jump down a little bit, one click below it. So, so they come with the hat, they come with the mask, the eye shield they wear inside the factory, right? So you check them in. Guess what happens when they're wearing the eye shield? You pull down the mask to adjust the eye shield, and then they pull it back. A simple act, simple act. But at that point, you are essentially introducing a risk to 6,000 people, because what happens today is calculating the cost of an average warehouse shutting down due to one guy infecting, one infection. It's about $100,000, 75 lakhs.
Wow.
So the costs are massive. Right? So it's not that wearing masks 24/7 is absolute guarantee that no one else will ever get it. They can get it from somewhere else, but it significantly minimizes. I think the percentage that I was looking at, it minimizes the percentage by 96, 97%, right? So just enforcing that, and a lot of times it's just what people forget, right? When they're adjusting this, they pull it down so that they can adjust the visor.
Correct.
And then they don't remember, right? Same thing with, I was talking to a school system in the US, right? School kids. So in the US, they're, essentially trying to enforce, the federal government is trying to enforce that the schools should be open.
Right.
Now, what happens when the primary kids, 6, 7-year-old, right, sit in a class, social distancing? They won't remember. It's not that they don't want to, right?
Correct.
If told, they are. Like, would a teacher teach or try to ensure that the mask is always on, or the kids are sitting 6 feet apart, right? So now, because if the teacher is continuously doing that, the study won't happen, right? Yeah. So how do you do all of that simultaneously? So it has to be technology-enabled, technology system, technology enforced.
Sure. So moving along, Shantanu, I'm always wanting to ask you this question. You've been part of some of these great brands that people want to be associated with. NASA, of course, is something that everyone wants to be a part of, or Facebook when it started and the buzz that it has created even now in India. It's been brilliant. But one question that I had is, do you think any of these, can we learn anything from these companies in terms of culture that they've built, or how they go about as a country, or and the reverse? Does it really apply the reverse as well? Will these actually, can they learn anything from us? I would like to know both.
Absolutely, that's an interesting question. Now I'm thinking. So it's interesting that you asked, right? So a couple of things, right? I have largely worked, so just to rephrase, I have worked with great brands, but they have largely been in technology, right? So I'll sort of index my answer for technology.
Right.
So 2 or 3 things that I have noticed in these companies, one is they're tech first, right? NASA is tech first, right? Facebook is definitely tech first. Google is technology first, right? Things such as process, procedures, everything matters, but matter a lot less than the technology that you're going after, right?
Sure.
So the goal, the aim, objective of this, right, is very clear that you have to build something and you have to build it technology first. So I'll explain what it, how it. So for example, if Facebook were to build, and they would not, not that I'm implying they would, a food delivery company, they'll actually try to crack the technology first. How do I optimize the delivery process? How do I ensure that food gets cooked in certain time and the freshness is maintained and so on? And then they'll figure out the different parts of it, right? What I've seen when I work with other companies here or consulted with them formally and informally is that we tend to do essentially a process first, which means given how hard the tech problem is, given how hard the data problem is, we sort of say, let's, let's pilot it in Indore, and if it works, we'll hire a lot more people, right? So we start with the process first and the people first. See, both, I am not saying demerits or demerits, but the one is technology first. The second thing, because you're sort of people first or process first, there's a great deal of emphasis on your role, title, and hierarchy, right? So people coming in, 2 years in this company, they say, oh, I want to be a data scientist. In the US, you'll find people with 15 years out of Berkeley PhD, 15 years of experience, have a title of senior data scientist and don't give a darn about it, because what they're really focused on is solving the hard problem. And they may be getting paid more than their 50s, right?
Right.
Well, that culture exists, right? If you're a good tech person and if you're focused on solving a problem, your salary band sort of is not related to what you are called, right? Or your title and none of that, right? What do you find out? It's a sort of, a lot more, a lot less emphasis on sort of your title, rank, all of that, right? You focus on, again, on solving the problem. As a result of the first two, what ends up happening, you see a lot of people who are sort of, high level of humility. Right? People, are not throwing their, ranks, titles, companies, and, you would not even know if you see them. A lot of my colleagues, if you see them walking on the street, you think that they are, working in a FedEx office, right? They're doing packages. They're so humble.
Right.
I'll tell you, some of it's actually, interestingly enough, some of it I see in Bangalore, in India, right? We have known of, the great, we have heard legendary stories about the greats of Mr. Ajim Premji, Mr. Narayan Murthy, and so on. Very humble people, Nandan Nilekani, very humble people, right? You see a lot of them in Bangalore, but in general, if you take India as back, we're not there yet, right? Now let me flip your question, which is what can they learn from India? Right? I think they can learn a lot from India that sort of doesn't exist in their culture, in the Western culture. The first of it is the informality, right?
Okay.
How you solve the problem in informal way. I was running AOL Time Warner's data globally in 2004 and 5, and the most horrified moment I have had when I was in New York and I was introducing one of my people to one of the senior vice presidents in the company. And the young gentleman, the first thing said, and I'm not using both of their names. After the meeting, we have, dinner and all that stuff. And then he said, Joe, can I have your mobile number? In the US in 2005, mobile number was sacrosanct, right? People didn't expect you to call after work, right? So the work-life balance there is much more, so it's delineated. Ours is sort of, it bleeds, right? Our work friends are much more friends.
Correct.
Than just co-workers, right? That actually helps solve a lot of problems. In fact, this is one of the first mistakes I made after coming back. You make mistakes and then you learn. You try to maintain that US sort of, cut off work means you are not going to go bother someone at night and all of that stuff. And I ended up realizing that most of the work are actually happening, over a dinner at night. Barriers that we have because the processes are not tightly established, right? So in the US, the processes and the technology take care of a lot of the barriers. This is well established. Here, the informal relationships take care of that.
Wow, so beautifully put, in fact. I think this will help a lot of people who move from the US to here to actually adapt especially technologists. I think they struggle quite a bit, and even vice versa, right? When people move from here overseas, how do they go ahead and decompartmentalize themselves? I think it's brilliantly put. Do you see that even Indian companies are becoming tech first? Do you happen to see that at all?
Absolutely, absolutely. You'll get a chuckle out of it. I'll tell you my favorite thing that I learned after coming back to India, how to solve the problem. The favorite sentences, and I landed up in Delhi, right? So I'll try my best of Hindi. He said, "Darna mat, backend se kara dunga." In the US, you'll never hear backend se karwa dunga. There's no backend, right? So, this is the best learning was backend se kara dunga, right?
Right.
But that captures our culture, right? That's a great strength of our culture. Um, so, um, to your question, back to your questions. Are Indian companies getting tech first? Many are. And what I really see and what I'm sort of, it's almost privileged to see this transition from a new generation of entrepreneurs. The first generation of entrepreneurs who will be, I got this is the third generation of entrepreneurs. The first generation of entrepreneurs, as I said, like Mr. Azim Premji or Narayan Mukherjee or Nandan, built great companies like Infosys. The second generation, like the Bansals, built the great companies like Flipkart. The third generations, who are just about starting now, literally in the past 2-3 years, these are the kids in their 20s now, are starting to build what I'd call as a tech first company. You see a lot of deep tech companies that are starting to emerge. It's not that they didn't exist, but they are starting to emerge in a larger number.
Right.
I sort of, one of my challenges after coming back 5 years back, I used to complain about it, that I could be in the valley, right? Drive up and down on 101, which is sort of the main thoroughfare, right? And then in the same day, Friday, I used to take off for learning. In the morning, I could visit a friend who's trying to figure out diesel from algae. Next meeting could be someone who's trying to reconstruct brain in a computer. The third meeting could be with someone who's trying to build a composite material for an aircraft or a spacecraft, lightweight. The fourth guy could be trying to build a competitor for Salesforce, right? Diverse technologies. And the fifth guy could be a friend in Tesla, whose factory is right next to my house, right? So it's like very diverse set of technologies. A lot of them are deep tech, right? It's more than halfway deep new stuff. Like no one would have imagined Tesla coming out of nowhere and sort of, changing not only, or Elon Musk coming out of, and changing the world of everything from car manufacturing to spacecraft launch, right?
Right.
So that, until about, I would say even 4 or 5 years backwards, I didn't see it. I'm starting to see the green shoots of that in the country. And, I'm hoping that this will sort of go in a long way. In next 10 years, we'll be talking about very different types of companies. We'll be talking about companies in robotics, as I said, vision science, deep AI, synthetic speeches, language translation, which is automatically Indian from other languages in real time and so on. A bunch of technologies that I'm seeing.
Right.
And those are the companies that will sort of, disproportionately disrupt the landscape, the tech landscape we have in the country.
Well, I do look forward that we have that video cast 5 years later and we talk about how you mentioned these and we deep dive into those at that point of time, Shantanu. I'll make a list of this for sure. Yeah. And having said that, you interestingly brought up my next question, which speaks about, the value of a data scientist in India. So when I began looking at the entire paradigm shift that happened, people started talking so much about data in India. And the only thing that they would come to me and say is, Rupa, we also need a data scientist. We want to hire a data scientist. So my first question to them would be that why do you need a data scientist at such a premature time of of your company? Because people fail to understand that you need to have data to have a data scientist looking at this data, right? So I would like you. This is for the benefit of so many founders out there, especially the seed funded or the ones who are looking at building a data platform. What would you say is the value of a pure data scientist here for these specific companies?
See, let me take a slightly broader view and then I'll come down to like funnel down to your question, right? The broader view is that the way to solve what I call as the India class problem, you have to solve that first in order to get anywhere. The reason delivery went from being smaller company that was competing with 16, 17 other companies, right? Opinio, Roadrunner, and a bunch of other names I remember. And then, one of them sort of just went out of the league and sort of became a unicorn, right? The sole reason for that was that the leadership had the vision and the courage to go solve the hard problems.
Mm-hmm.
uh, obviously just like everything else, they did worry about where our next round of funding is going to come from and all that wonderful stuff. But that didn't prevented them from saying these are the three hardest problems we'll solve and we'll take a bet, right? So it comes from there. You need to identify, and the base problems, I'll tell you 4 or 5 base problems in India that Indians sort of need to look at. First of all is your what I call as identity disambiguation, right? Which means figuring out who that person is. Now that sounds like very easy. So I'll give an example from my current employer, Airtel. When I was talking about the same thing with the leadership, the first thing they said, no, that is not a problem for Airtel. We have 97+% or whatever the number was, Aadhaar verified, which is true. If you try to get a SIM card and it's Aadhaar verified, he said, so what's your challenge? Why do you need to verify that identity? Okay, I kept quiet about it. A few months later, I go in and look at the databases. Looks like, let's say 80-ish%, because as high as our SIMs are men, SIM cards are men, 20% are women. So obviously it's not that 80% of the men in the country, of all the phone user base, it was 80% men and only 20% were women. I mean, pretty much there's no gender discrimination there as far as I can see. Mobile phone is available to everyone, right? So what happened there? What happened there was a cultural aspect, which is from the small town I come from, or even my household, right? We have 8 SIMs between, the family members, people who work in the household and all of that stuff. And guess in whose name all the 8 SIMs are?
Yours?
Mine, right? So my wife is using it, my daughter is using it, one of the maids is using it, but it's always me, right? So all in a smaller town, right? For example, in my hometown, it's rarely a young lady would go to a shop and get it, right? It's a brother, cousin, father, whoever, anyone but her, right? The culture norms, right? Now, all of a sudden, you've got data that's captured 100% and captured 97% correctly and about 50% wrong, right? Right? So what happened there? Now you need to figure out, because now if suppose you're going to run a marketing campaigns.
Sure.
Right? Now if you say that this is the Shantanu has 8 SIMs, now you go look at it. In some SIMs, he has a, he's using 2 gigs of data per day, has a 799 per month package. And another one, it's a 30 rupees recharge. And you try to figure out why Shantanu needs 8 SIM cards, right? And has such a diverse distribution pattern, right? So just figuring out at least the gender of the person using that SIM itself is a computing problem. So I'll tell you how you solved it, and this is very interesting. So it looks like the men, and so what he did by call fingerprinting, right? Men and women have distinct calling patterns. Men make smaller number of calls, larger number of calls, shorter duration. Women make smaller number of calls, larger duration. Right? So that's one simple. Then there are men who also have a women-like pattern, right? Which is they make lesser number of calls but longer duration.
Sure.
Now the second order problem is how do you differentiate between this men and women, right? It turns out, Rupa, and I'm sure you will endorse what I'm just saying, women's Paretos of call are very different, which is there are 2 people in their lives they call most, very long calls, and then the rest drops. For men, it tends to be more uniform. And the 2 people are typically a mom and a sister, a mom and a cousin sister, a mom and a friend and a cousin sister, all. Is that correct? Yeah. 2 people, 2 women in your life who you speak to most.
Sure.
Now that all of a sudden, after we did all of that, and we used a reference base to check against that, the accuracy for gender went up. Now, if you're a small company, if you're now trying to do marketing campaigns, just like I described, and if you want to understand their gender, if you are a fashion company, right?
Mm.
And if you just take the database and say these are all men because the SIM card says it's a man,
Mm.
and you are just trying to sell them shoes and a men's shoes and ties, and they're never responding, you know why they're not responding.
Correct.
So the idea here is the data you collect in India is likely to be skewed by the social and cultural norms. That's point number one. Two, you really need to spend your time understanding your customers, sir. Because unless you understand your customers, sir, you will not understand how they reflect uh, the skewness in the data,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
And once you understand those, use data scientists to go back and correct your reference data, gender, location we talked about, all of that, build that base, and then you can run a business out of it. If you don't do any of them, you will end up essentially doing cashback. I mean, the only thing that the entire country into have learned, if you give cashback, some customers will come, install your app. After some time, they'll go away. You'll never scale.
You're right. Right. So how do you think all of this will eventually change? Let's say we fix most of these things, right? And then there is a pattern to the data. So what do you think would be, because you've written loads of articles about predictions for AI as well for I've seen them since 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. So interestingly, Shantanu, would you be able to tell me if most of this gets cleared up for India? What can we expect? One is, of course, clearing it. You've bifurcated it. Just for example's sake, what is the next thing? People are speaking so much about AI, artificial intelligence out here. Does it really exist? This is one of the pertinent questions I have in my head at most point of times. Does it really exist? If it does, to what level can we actually move the needle?
So first of all, it does in a limited number of companies. Second, the needle can be moved dramatically. As I was telling you, an example, my estimate is that if you just figure out the last mile, which is I spent a great 5 years of my life, if you look at a lot of my papers around that, right. Just that last mile, improving just the last mile and figuring out the right address. I'll give you a number. We estimated about 2 years back that at minimum, it will add to $10 to $12 billion to the GDP. That's a large number, just address, right? That at that time was almost 0.5% of the GDP. So start figuring out piece by pieces, and the impacts, one, is real. Second, it's going to be significant, right? See, you're not going to go change the cultural norms of the country in next 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, or even 20 years, right? So you sort of don't have a way, you cannot say that, and someday people will just go to the store and buy their SIM cards in their own name, and therefore it'll get better. Someday people will figure out the way to write address perfectly. It won't happen. It hasn't happened in a couple of thousand years, unlikely to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years, right? But once you do that, first of all, the first jump of getting the data right itself is a reasonable big one, because unless you get your data quality right? You can model the world as much as you want, but it's a garbage in, garbage out problem, right? If you're putting in the garbage in a model, all you'll do is garbage out. And the reason why people keep complaining and saying that our data is bad, our model is bad, our data scientists are not able to give me a model very good, it's largely because people don't spend time in the inflow part of it, which is looking at the data, looking at the quality of the data, looking at how data is impacted by the social norms, right? And people just don't, this is a bit of a, like, I don't know why people just don't want to spend doing that job. It looks like it feels like it's a dirty job, right? So I'll give you another example. When you and I, have you ever bought a refrigerator?
Yeah, long back, yeah.
Long back. So people, look at the app, any e-commerce app.
Yeah.
You and I, the first 50 million who have the money and, have been the first set of customers on e-commerce. When you buy our new refrigerator, we'll check out, if you look at the search, right? It will say 100 liter, I think 110 liter, 150 liters, 175 liters. Single door, double door, right? So, auto defrost, right? Fruit basket on the side, on the top, right? Vegetable and fruit basket. Bottle holders, big, small, all of that. So what you do, and you would go figure that out. In the last minute, someone in the household, your wife, your spouse, wants to go see the refrigerator before placing an order on Flipkart or Amazon, right? You go to I'm making, I'm just saying a Bangalore, taking an example of Bangalore, go to a Pi Electronics, right? As you're walking around, the salesman knows that you are um, window shopping. You have already figured out all. So you will specifically ask for a model number, etc., etc. Right? And this is, for example, in Coromandel. So he will come and ask you, saying that he'll not. He said, "Do you need help?" He'll say no. As you're about to walk up the store, he'll say, "Sir, just two things. We match online prices, and you can get the refrigerator tomorrow morning. And if there is any issue, here's my mobile number. You can call me." At which point you're thinking that if you order online, first of all, you have no one to call. You'll call a call center. Here I have this guy's mobile number. Number two, he'll give it tomorrow morning. Online, it will come 3 days later. And more often than not, he'll end up doing a transaction. He exactly knows he has spent 2 minutes of his time to tell you how to convert it. Right? Whether you convert or not is a different thing. Go to a place called Holinabu, which is the south of the city, more rural. Right? People, first-time buyers of the refrigerator, this is the next 200 million in India. Rural, have seen ads of refrigerator, etc., right, on the TV, have a limited budget. They walk in sort of not sure of being in a fancy store like that, etc., etc., going around, talking to each other, Guess what the salesperson comes and talks about?
The budget?
Nope. The only question he asks, how many people in the house?
Ah.
Guess what? He knows that he's not going to keep, bottles of Cokes, right? He's largely going to keep some cooked food, some vegetables, right, etc., and budget constraint. So he's trying to match under those. But if you are a product manager or a data product manager for one of the apps, if you're trying to get to the next 200 million, how do you change your search or filter? Right? That filter of 150 liters, he has no idea what 150 liters. Right? Double door, single door, it does not matter. Right? How do you change it? So you have to start thinking about what data to collect in order to build your search and your algorithm, right? Unless you're ready to do that hard work, right? You'll not be able to be successful. It goes for both the data scientists, the data product managers, and so on, right? I have actually run this test with at least a dozen data product manager, data scientists. There's only one person who was in that.
Oh, okay.
So income, I sort of led you to that. Most people will say income no. The first question he asked, and I have gone to umpteen number of stores. The first question they all is how many people in the family. Because the families tend to be larger, so you have to optimize between the number of people in the family, types of food they're going to store, and the budget. It's a very different optimization than someone who's going to store big bottles of Coke and a wine bottle and is looking for self-defrosting and a big tray of for making ice, right? So that's the part that you sort of need to spend a lot of time on understanding the cultural nuances to understand what they need to collect, build a repository of that, and on top of that, build your models. Unless you do that, your problem is going to be garbage in, garbage out.
Right. I think it brings us back to the basics, right? In terms of understanding your customer and building things around it. I think the way you put it across was, it's very simple even for a person like me to understand. Thank you so much for that. I'll keep this refrigerator problem for other people as well when I talk to them. Right. Shantanu, one of the last questions that I'd like to jump onto is what's happening in today's date and time. It's pretty sad that, the whole world is under pandemic, and it all started when we didn't know what the entire piece was all about. And on today's date and time, at least we have some sense of what is going around in the world, especially with Bangalore's numbers going up so periodically every day. Do you think that data science can really help during this period of time with contact tracing and things of that sort?
It's been a big way, in a very big way. I mean, in other places around the world, a lot of data has been used to figure out a scientific way to build the containment zones, right? Red, yellow, greens. A scientific way to figure out three things, right? See, eventually what you have to get down to is three things. It's the lives, right? It's the safe places and the livelihoods. Lives is all about people. Safe places are which places locked down or unlocked down. Livelihood is eventually have to come out of it, right? Right? And make living, because you cannot keep people in lockdown forever, right?
Right.
The short answer for this is, without going into like a great deal of detail, because I can spend another hour talking about it, because this is yet another area where I'm working with multiple governments here and abroad. But absolutely, the data science, as I said, figuring out who are the people. Contact tracing is a basic thing. Right? If you had something, are there people around you who you could have been in touch with? What are your potential areas you went to? All of that can be done in mathematical ways. You can look at people's movement, for example, and then predict how the disease, based on epidemiological model, how the disease might spread. You can allocate resources that way, which is, and if you think the next place, the workers went from Bangalore to Gulbarga, then you say that, let's set up, the move whatever the resources we have, the PPE kits, the medicines and all there, right? You can actually predict those. Or migrants went from here to a village in Malda, which is a district in Bengal. You could do it very, very scientifically, right? So that's one. Second thing, safe places. Based on the same set of data, you can sort of grade your places as safe places and safe corridors, which means safe places mean the building I'm sitting in today. I came to the office to, do this podcast. Is this a safe place? Safe corridor, is Delhi Metro a safe corridor? Within that Delhi Metro, how many, what corridors are safer, right? What areas do you keep the doors locked, the stations locked, versus which metro stations you open up? How do you, then they all about livelihood, right? How do you safely unlock down places? Everything from the basic things as markets, schools, to things such as malls, restaurants, movie theaters, and all of that. And most of it can be mathematically modeled. And the mathematical model, if nothing else, gives you, nothing is perfect in life, right? I mean, this COVID has been a challenge. The virus has been a challenge. It has demonstrated so many characteristics that is unlike viruses, right? That, the scientists have truly struggled. WHO has struggled, the US CDC has struggled, we have struggled in the country, and so on. But, the beauty of what I call as a scientific process is that you just sort of take the latest thing that comes into your head, the latest data, right? And you improvise and improve on what you have done. Right? That's better than sort of throwing guesswork and, or, taking more draconian measures of essentially shutting down. Say, for example, if it's a part of the city that you have, COVID situation, you shut down the entire city. That can always be done. But that eventually ends up killing the livelihood in a way that's sort of detrimental to the longer term growth, even shorter term growth, right? So, short answer, can be done immensely. The examples that exist around the world. In fact, surprisingly, I am associated with a couple of international orgs that are doing that. And interestingly now, some of the smaller countries, poorer smaller countries that don't have as much resources, are actually doing a good job. Sometimes not knowing what your limitation is not a bad
thing. Excellent thought. So just before we wrap up, Shantanu, I wanted to actually check with you. Loads of people want to become data scientists, especially the youngsters and the ones who are listening to this series. What is that one, I wouldn't call it mentorship, because mentorship takes a longer time, but one suggestion you'd like to give them?
Very simple. What I'm seeing in the country, a lot of people are doing, 3 courses on, the MOOCs, and coming back and claiming that, I'm a data scientist because I've done course here. There's no shortcut to it, right? 3 things you need to do. You really need to understand math and stat. Without that, you cannot become a data scientist. Just understand, downloading stuff from GitHub or downloading someone else's code and trying to implement in your situations. You have to understand the basic of the math and the statistics. Number 2, you have to at least start implementing some algorithm in your current situation. Like for example, I don't code often anymore, but there's enough things that on the open sources that you can actually, um, for example, your own Twitter data. You can get Twitter data. You can figure out how to analyze it. You can figure out how to build a bot that sort of mimics that, and you can implement in your own Twitter handle. Nothing stops you from doing that, right? So do it. You know, build algorithms, practice it out, do it on your own, right? And the third thing I would suggest is that be very diligent, right? It takes long hours and long practices. Uh, it's sometimes better if you're in an adjacency area like data engineering or so, to be able to then to jump into data sciences. But as long as you have the fundamentals of at least the math and stat, and you are willing to work very hard, right? Um, and sort of build things on your own, you have a shot. Don't jump into it because everyone else is jumping into it. That's the wrong way to do it, because just like everything else, I've seen it with the fourth one, right? It started with Y2K in the 2000s, everyone was jumping there. Then it was SAP implementation. Then it was yet another flavor of something or the other. This is yet another flavor, right? If you jump into it and you don't do a good job, you will essentially end up hurting your career in a big way. Not in the long term, even in a shorter time, in the next 3 to 5 years, in a way that may be unrecoverable. So don't do it. Do it for the right reason. I tell people that do anything, right? Do anything and everything, do it for the right reason. Don't do it for the wrong reason, it never works. The wrong reason here is I need a job in data science. That's that's the wrong reason. If you're, oh, a lot of my friends are getting a cool data science job, that's the wrong reason, right? I really want to go and solve a lot of hard problems using data science. I don't have a background, but I'm willing to learn, spend time on it, is the right reason. Right?
Great, great. Thank you so much for that, Shantanu. I'm sure loads of people listening to this series, especially youngsters, would really know how should they define their problem and then attack and find a solution. For most people who don't know and who are watching this podcast, Shantanu is not as serious as he looks on this podcast. He's actually an extremely jovial person who lives life to the fullest. And for a data scientist, I've met quite a few. It's very easy to get along with Shantanu. So all those people who want to work with a gentleman like Shantanu, you should definitely try your hands at it. So here's, I'm just trying to be vocal and say it on your behalf.
All right, thank you so much. It's, look, the other advice I give to people is enjoy what you do. And if you do that every day, I mean, as I said, I come to work 7 days a week. I actually come to office 6 days, including Saturday. Some Sundays I don't come to office, and unless you immensely enjoy what you do, you wouldn't have done it for 30 years, right? When I joined the data science, the only thing, I mean, when I started working on the data, the only thing being an expert on data guaranteed was a very long-term unemployment, and the world has changed in 30 years. So you need to start enjoying what you do, and then eventually it always works out, right? And a part of the manifestation of how much you enjoy what you do is what you just said. Like, people are happy, jovial. Most of the people who I know enjoy what they do are of that nature. Thank you for the compliment. Thank you for taking the time to chit chat. It's been a while. We haven't spoken. Hopefully this is helpful for a couple of people, even if it changes one person's life, help them learn something, get into a new career track. I'd be thrilled.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be a ripple effect, Shantanu. Thank you so much for being a part of this podcast, and we'll stay in touch. So please stay safe. And, even though you're at work right now, I would still say stay safe and have a good time.
You have a good day. Thank you, Rupa.
Thank you so much, Shantanu. Bye-bye.